The alternative to fleeing from truth is fighting for truth. I was walking around Oxford a few months ago, and two guys walking just ahead of me were having a spirited conversation about how crazy they found certain beliefs that they disagreed with. And one turned to the other and said, maybe the only solution would be to shame them out of their beliefs. And then the other guy turned, and this is what he said. I wrote it down. He said, yes, that's what we should do. We should ridicule them mercilessly in the most insensitive ways we can think of. That's an exact quote. And then they turned and they swiped their faculty cards and walked into the University of Oxford Theoretical Physics building. These were probably scholars at Oxford, a place that prides itself on intellectual freedom and the exchange of ideas, and merciless, insensitive ridicule was the best that they could come up with for how we should resolve disagreement. I found myself wondering how many beliefs they held in theoretical physics that one day will be considered ridiculous. How does someone get to this point? How does someone get to the point where merciless ridicule seems like the best way forward? I think it's because you come to see truth as greater than love. If truth is greater than love, then you fight. Then the pursuit of truth justifies whatever means necessary, whether the means of Oxford academics or the means of terrorists. The alternative is that love is greater than truth. Then you flee. You flee from the dangers of truth and accept every belief, no matter how incoherent, because at least that's better than starting yourself on a trajectory that ultimately is going to lead to intolerance, extremism, and violence. Either truth gets sacrificed at the altar of love, or love gets sacrificed at the altar of truth. Either truth is greater than love, or love is greater than truth. Fight or flee. This is the cultural ultimatum that we're living in. What's your choice? And I don't think it's getting any better. I had a graphic here of a representation of our increasing political polarization in this country. And when you see the difference between 1994 and 2004, it's very minimal in terms of our political values. And then when you see the widening of the gap between 2004 and 2014, it's huge. 92% of Republicans are to the right of the median Democrat, and 94% of Democrats are to the left of the median Republican. We're not close enough to talk to each other. And so from that distance, all you can do is either ignore each other or shout at each other. Once again, fight or flee. What's your choice? Maybe there's another way. Hassan John was one of my students last year. He's an Anglican minister from northern Nigeria. And on the first day of classes, at lunch, one of his fellow classmates said to him, Hassan, how do you manage to minister in a context in which you're viewed as the enemy? We knew that Hassan was from a region that was terrorized by Boko Haram. We found out only later that he had been shot at twice and that there was a bounty on his head. Hassan began to tell us a story of how there came a point when he had seen so many of his brothers and sisters murdered for their faith that he started a conversation with a known gun dealer to acquire an AK-47. And he thought violence was the only answer. When he was in his home trying to figure out where to get the money to acquire this gun, a young girl ran by the front door of his home during school hours. He stopped her and he said, why aren't you in school? She said, my parents don't have the money to pay. He said, that's not right. My church and I would like to pay for your school fees. Will you take me to your parents? And then his stomach knotted up as she walked him across the clear dividing line between the Christian section of town and the Muslim section of town. He had assumed that this girl was from a Christian home. She was in fact from a Muslim home. But he had committed to paying her school fees. And so Hassan and his church began to pay her school fees. Then he found out that her brothers were also not in school. Then he met another Muslim child who wasn't in school, and another, Today, there are 200 Muslim children who are being educated in church schools by Hassan and his church. Then Hassan thought to himself, why are we only helping the children? He realized that the women in his community had a style of making clothes that the Muslim women didn't have. And the Muslim women had a style of cooking that the Christian women didn't have. And now there are 160 Christian and Muslim women who get together and share their expertise and befriend each other and bless each other. Just before Hassan came to Oxford, some militant youths who were involved in terrorism showed up at his front door. And he was scared. He thought his life was in danger. He thought his family's life was in danger. And they looked at him sternly and they said, why don't you do anything for us? You help the children. You help the women. Why don't you do anything for us? Militant youth engaged in terrorism are showing the door of an Anglican pastor asking him to incorporate them into his mission strategy. Absolutely unbelievable. And here's my question. Why did those youth respond so positively? After all, Hassan was disagreeing with them in a big way. For starters, he was saying that Jesus Christ should be at the center of their education. He was also clearly saying that we should love our enemies, we should turn the other cheek, and we should pray for those who persecute us, things that would not have been true in their worldview. But here's the thing. Hassan's disagreement with them was not greater than his love for them. His loving sacrifice for them was the very content of his disagreement with them. He cut the link between disagreement and devaluing of the person because his communication of truth was one and the same as his communication of love. And that is the gospel. That is the central message of Christianity. Jesus disagreed with us. His very coming was an act of disagreement with us, a statement that we required saving because our lives disagreed so badly with what he had intended for them. But Jesus' coming was also his greatest act of love for us. His willingness to suffer alongside us, his willingness to join us in our shame, his willingness to lay down his life for us. The cross where Jesus died, the symbol of Christianity, it's a symbol of the perfect intersection of love and truth. Jesus' death is the greatest expression of God's disagreement with us, and yet simultaneously, it is the greatest expression of God's love for us. Truth and love, perfectly united in a personal sacrifice. Not truth is greater than love, not love is greater than truth, but God is love, and God is truth, and therefore, truth is love. In Jesus, truth equals love. And therefore, I think Jesus is uniquely positioned to get us out of the cultural ultimatum that we're stuck in. Fight or flee. Authentic Christianity rejects that ultimatum. It refuses to let disagreement lead to the devaluing of the other. It refuses to choose between truth and love because according to Jesus and in the person of Jesus and in his sacrifice, truth and love are one and the same. On one of his last Sundays with us in Oxford, our pastor interviewed Hassan, and his first question was, he asked Hassan, is it worth it? And Hassan had this sort of quizzical look on his face because the answer was so obvious to him. And he said, of course. And then our pastor asked Hassan if he had any parting words for us as a church. And he said that he did. And then he said, I beg you, do not compromise here in the West on the faith that we in Africa are dying for. Do not compromise here in the West on the faith that we in Africa are dying for. And I personally have to keep reminding myself that this is not extraordinary Christianity. This is just the simple message of Jesus. Truth that is love, love that is truth. Laying down your life in order to communicate the truth to others? Who are you laying down your life for? Every Christian needs to be able to answer that question. How often is our disagreement with others our very act of giving our lives for them? What would that look like in our contexts? What would it look like for us to disagree with people with such generosity and such love and such personal sacrifice that the people we're disagreeing with would show up on our front doorstep, as they did with Hassan, asking for us to act on our disagreement with them? Who do you disagree with passionately? Who's your enemy? I wonder if someone just jumped into your mind as I asked those questions. Are you fighting them? Are you fleeing from them? Or are you making a personal sacrifice for them? What would it look like to communicate truth to those we disagree with through an act of radical love and personal sacrifice? That is the question. I don't think that's an easy question, but that is the question that Hassan figured out how to answer in his context. And I think we will live in brokenness until we can figure out how to answer that question in our context. We're being told that we live in a post-truth society, that truth is dead. I don't think that truth is dead, but I do think that truth died. 2,000 years ago, on a wooden cross, the truth was stretched, the truth was twisted, and it was bent. The truth hurt, and the truth was buried. Love and truth. This is the central message of the Christian faith. Love and truth find their unity and their power in personal sacrifice. And there's only one God who has sacrificed himself for us. And that's the God that I commend to you today. A brief word of prayer with me. God, I thank you that I can come to you with such confidence that you are both love and truth. I thank you that when you came and made a sacrifice that you didn't have to make, you told me the truth about myself. You convinced me of the evil in my heart because people just like me killed you. And yet simultaneously, you convinced me of your love for me because you showed me that there was nothing that you wouldn't give, even your very life, that I might be in friendship and relationship with you for all eternity. And God, if that vision of love and truth perfectly intersecting in perfect unity that is true only in you, if there's anyone in this room who doesn't know that possibility, who has felt like they need to choose, I pray that today would be a day where that vision of who you are, perfect love and perfect truth, would settle deep within our souls and would bring transformation. I trust you for that. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Vince. When I stand up before you, I feel a little bit like the man who owned a business on fortune telling and had a few hundred palm readers. And he would gather them all together and said to them, I hate to give you this news, but we're going to have to let about half of you go. He said, but then again, you all probably knew that was coming. And so when I stand up in front of a Google audience, I wonder if there's anything I can say that you don't already know, that you've either heard or read somewhere. I mean, you're an amazing group of people. A company starting off with the proper name, that turns into a verb across the globe. I remember being picked up in Delhi late one night by the hotel limousine. And as he was driving me, I was quite tired. You know, when you land after a day's journey, you look like your passport picture. And he was driving me to the airport, and then he told me how many books I had written. I said, "How do you know that?" He said, "Before I came, I Googled your name, sir." And so here's a limousine driver quoting you guys thousands of miles away using a word that has now become synonymous with actionable intelligence. So you are certainly one of the prime movers of turning thought into action. But I will always remember what I heard one speaker say. I cannot remember where it was where I heard him say it. He said, "You may have a smartphone, but that is no guarantee that it is a wise phone." All kinds of access to information does not guarantee how we ought to live. It only tells us how we can live. When you put capacity and possibility and ideas within reach, if you have not trained the character to use that capacity, all you end up doing is putting the reach for some very, very heinous ends in the hands of a person who does not know what to do with that except to break it. That's a sobering thought for you. It's a very sobering thought for a person like me. Where do you go to find wisdom? It was Aldous Huxley writing in the 40s, who made the comment, "I want this world not to have meaning." In his book, Ends and Means, I want this world not to have meaning, because a meaningless world, said he, gives me the freedom to my own sexual proclivities and my political ambitions. A meaningless world puts at my disposal the possibility of all that I want to do without any moral boundaries. You know, it was Andrew Fletcher, the 18th century political activist from Scotland, who said, "Let me write the songs of a nation. I don't care who writes its laws. Let me write the songs of a nation. I don't care who writes its laws, because knowledge is a deadly friend when no one sets the rules." And the rock group said, "And the fate of all mankind, I see, is in the hands of fools." Confusion will be my epitaph as I crawl a cracked and broken path. If we make it, we can all sit back and laugh. But I'm afraid tomorrow I'll be crying. You see, once upon a time, you had to go to places in order to become wrong-headed. Now those places come to you and dangle on your hip and have the capacity to take young minds and pervert them so quickly and so soon that I think you and I both have an extraordinary responsibility to this generation. How do we give them what they can do? And where do they go to find out what they ought to do? Because true freedom is really not the liberty to do whatever we want, but the strength to do what we ought. Think of it this way. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the reception of his Nobel Prize made an extraordinary speech, and his closing lines said this, where he started off by saying, "I refuse to believe that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in a river of life. I refuse to believe that we are so bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of priesthood and peace and brotherhood will not become a reality. I refuse all these things." And then he ended by saying this, "I believe unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality." Imagine that. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. Now, our entire educational system is based on naturalism, the metaphysical extrapolations of a materialistic worldview. But if unarmed truth and unconditional love will have to have the final word in reality, that does not come from scientific imperatives. Those are philosophical, indeed metaphysical, or if you would, spiritual platitudes. That unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final day in reality. And if that doesn't what you end up is the young man being put into a plane and shipped across 10,000 miles and comes home as a physical zombie to be held in the arms of his parents, who are glad just to be able to hold him, even though he cannot even respond. We are living in a world of immense possibilities, and men and women like you have that incredible responsibility of how you're going to guide our young and how you're going to determine that truth and love will have the final word in reality. Otherwise, the victory will be Pyrrhic, where the vanquished has gained more than the victor. And so I bring to you this question in a very simple way within a few minutes. It all has to do with this very basic question. In our book, Jesus Among Secular Gods, we deal with humanism and existentialism and naturalism and evolutionism and all of that. And we give the Christian alternatives. What is the alternative that Jesus Christ really gives to you and me? And I have to say this, I do not know of any answers that anybody gives that correspond more to reality as we live it out and put together a coherent worldview as the teachings of Jesus did, going back 2,000 years and what he taught, and prior to that, of course, building on the shoulders of the prophets and all who had spoken before him. And the question is this, what does it mean to be human? That's the question from where we start. What does it mean to be human? What is it that you essentially represent? Not what you existentially may crave, but what is it that you essentially represent? Who you are in your innermost being. In our search for identity today, which is a very real search, if we do not know who we are in our essence, then the Chestertonian warning is true, that there are many, many angles at which you can fall and only one angle at which you can stand straight. And G.K. Chesterton went on to say, the tragedy of disbelieving in God is not that a person ends up believing in nothing. Alas, it is much worse. That person may end up believing in anything. A young student at Harvard made this comment to Kelly Monroe Kuhlberg in a book, Finding God at Harvard. He said this, I am allowed to believe anything here, so long as I don't claim it to be true. That is ironic because the very motto of Harvard is veritas, which means the imperative for the reason for their existence, something that you can never affirm in your life. How ironic, how contradictory has life begun? I want to give you 4 very quick answers to this. I've dealt with it more extensively, and I believe in one of the chapters of the book I deal with this, and it is this. But let me go back this way. In the year 2000, the former Soviet Union released its political prisoners. One of them was a man by the name of András Tamas, a Hungarian, who had been incarcerated by them for 55 years, most of the time in solitary confinement. They believed he'd gone insane and they were going to do away with him. But András Tamas showed moments and flashes of reality which made them think maybe he was just medically ill. So a Hungarian psychiatrist offered to come and treat him. And he did. And as he walked away from the room, he said, he is not insane. You have driven him to the point of near insanity. Give him back to us. We will make him well again. So he was put into a wheelchair, and András Tamas is being wheeled out. And as he's being wheeled out, he makes his first request. He was speaking an old Hungarian dialect. He'd gone into prison when he was 20. He was now 75. And he made his first request. He wanted to see a mirror. He'd not seen his face in 55 years. So there you are in the vibrancy of youth and strong. And over half a century later, you're going to look at your face for the first time. And as soon as he looked at his face, he could barely stand it for more than a moment, turned the mirror down, put his face in his hands, and sobbed uncontrollably. They destroyed him. They destroyed him. He never remembered what he looked like and longed for the day when he was a mere 20 to see what he was in the prime of his youth. Is there a mirror for the soul? Is there a mirror for our essence? The Bible says, yes, there is. And I give you 4 quick answers. Number 1, that we have a creator, which means life has a purpose. Every time you read a book, you know there's an author to that book. There is a writer, there is an intent, there is a storyline. And if that creator has revealed his plan for us and given to us two things, intrinsic worth and reflective splendor. Intrinsic worth and reflective splendor. How do we know what that intrinsic worth is? There are two amazing conversations Jesus has in the Gospel of Mark in Mark chapter 12. The first one comes to him and is trying to pit politics against politics. And he says to him, is it all right to pay taxes to Caesar? And how desperately we wish Jesus had said no. But Jesus said, do you have a coin? And the man said, yes. He said, give it to me. And he looked at the coin and looked at the man and he said, whose image do you see on this? And the man said, Caesar. Jesus said, give to Caesar that which belongs to Caesar and give to God that which belongs to God. The man should have had a follow-up question. The follow-up question should have been, what belongs to God? And Jesus would have said, whose image is on you? You belong to God. It's not surprising that he refers to this body as the temple of the living God, where you commune with him. It's a tent. It's not anything of permanence, but it is a shelter. It is a place where you have communion. No other worldview gives you that description of Imago Dei. You're not God. There's a Hindi song which we used to sing when I was young. Na main Bhagwan hu, na main shaitan hu. Duniya jo chahe samjho, main to insan hu. I am not God, nor am I the devil. You can say what you will. I am a human being. I'm a human being. Na main Bhagwan, I'm not God. Na main shaitan, I'm not Satan. The world, you can choose what you will. I have concluded I am a human being. And Jesus takes that to the highest possible level. You're not God. You're not human, but you are made in the image of God to be self-determining and have moral reasoning capacity. That's the difference. We have moral reasoning capacity. That's what made America very unique in the experimentation of political theory. It was not reasoning alone, which the French philosophers and the German philosophers and all talked about reasoning, and all the way from man is the measure of all things, going back to the Greek thinkers and coming through Descartes and so on, where you just because you doubt, therefore you know that you exist. Moral reasoning, the sense of is and oughtness, is what drove the American dream. Gertrude Himmelfarb, professor of Columbia University, in her book Roads to Modernity, has a whole chapter on the evangelical awakening of all people, a philosopher like that, talking about the impact of the Wesleyan meetings to awaken England to the moral reasoning capacity that we have, intrinsic worth. And then the second conversation Jesus has in the same chapter is the man trying to set religion against religion, law against law, not politics against religion. He said, what's the greatest commandment? See, Moses gave 613. Isaiah reduced them to 11, David to 15, Micah to 3, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly before your God. Jesus could have reduced it to 1. He didn't. He said, you know what the greatest commandment is? To love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. He said, on these two commandments hang all of the laws and the prophets. Because of the first, the second follows. Without the first, the second is with your feet firmly planted in midair. I cannot violate you because you are made in the image of God. And out of all of the 613 laws, my Lord reduced it to 2, to love him and to love you. I have no right to violate you or in any way to dismember who you are. That's why we are called individuals. We are indivisible. There is that composite reality to your life and mine. Intrinsic worth and reflective splendor. The reflective splendor being this, that you have an individual relationship in this cosmic community. I was gone for about 4 months through many countries, got home last week and spent this last 5-6 days at home. They were beautiful. To know that I was having dinner with my wife every night, that's a huge blessing. And then to know that the grandkids could come and open the door without even knocking. Nice to see you, Papa. We celebrated a birthday. When I get back on Friday, I'll have to go through a tortuous 1-hour ballet recital of 2 4-year-old grandkids. And they want to make sure I'm coming back for that. You see, in this world of so many people we love and know, there's a particularity to relationships which defines who you and I are in the microcosm of a family. My son went to Taylor University, Indiana in 2006. They had a horrible accident there. And all of them were smashed to death in a van coming home from a weekend of doing some work. And as the funerals were held, there was only one gal whose life was spared. Her name was Laura Van Ryn. And so the Van Ryn family came, stood by her bedside day after day, week after week. But as she began to gain her composure, her boyfriend said, something's not right. This is not Laura. He said, what do you mean this is not Laura? She's all mangled. She'll come to it. He said, no, this is not Laura. The answers are not making any sense, but they seem to be making sense to her. Finally, one day she opened her eyes and she said, why do you all keep calling me Laura? My name is Whitney. I'm not Laura. So the father, Van Ryn dad, gets on the phone and calls the office. Was there a girl by the name of Whitney in the van? He said, yes, there was a Whitney Sirac. He said, we think we've got Whitney in the bed here. It's not Laura. They called the coroner. Have you done a DNA test after the deaths? No. He instantly lost his job. They had the wrong name for the person. And who they had buried as Whitney Sirac was actually Laura Van Ryn. And the girl they thought was Laura in the bed was actually Whitney Sirac. So one comes back to change the grave marker, and the other goes home thinking they had their daughter, but didn't. You see, there is a particularity to your life. Only God is big enough in a world of billions of people to give you individual worth and the individual access to a relationship. Only God is big enough for that in the created order. I will just mention 2 others and then underscore the third. The second is the incarnation, from creation to incarnation. Third is transformation, and fourth is consummation. And let me just talk about the incarnation and miss the other 2 because time has run out. In the incarnation of Jesus Christ, we see the absoluteness of the moral law and the supremacy of love. The absoluteness of the moral law and the supremacy of love. And in that, the absoluteness of the moral law and the supremacy of love, you go through any kinds of humanism, evolutionary humanism, behavioral humanism, existential humanism, pragmatic humanism, Marxist humanism, existential humanism, cultural humanism. You take all the 6 or 7 types of various humanisms. All of them struggle with these 2. Where do we find the absolute moral law? How do we find and come to the conclusion of the supremacy of love? My daughter, who works with the broken of this world, rescuing women from the sex trafficking industry and children with AIDS, or called me this morning from Atlanta. She said, Dad, I have to give a talk on pain and suffering and how meaning can come out of that. Can we talk for a little while? It was early in the morning. She had forgotten I was in California time. And so anyway, we talked about it. And I said to her in a very simple verse, God displayed for you and me in the brokenness on the cross how the redemptive work of God went on in your life and mine. So you see, he moves us from creation to the incarnation, to the key point here, the transformation. What is desperately needed in this world is a transformed heart and a transformed will and different hungers that God alone is big enough to give within your heart and mind. I am a testimony to it, and I will close with a simple illustration. I was 17 years old growing up in India. India is a country of incredible pressure in academics. You don't just have to pass, you have to come at the top of the class. And if you're not going to make it, you're going to bring shame to the family. The highest number of suicides take place in India within a week after the results are published in the newspapers. They're jumping off buildings, they're killing themselves. They have words for that kind of thing. I remember being called that kind of word periodically by my dad when I wasn't making it, till finally it drove me to a bed of suicide. And I said, I'm not going to make it in my father's estimation. And at the age of 17, a Bible was brought to me. I didn't own a Bible. I'd never opened a Bible. I never cared for it. And to read in that gospel story, Jesus said, because I live, you also shall live. And making my commitment in all that blurred way, I'll never forget the words of the doctor when he came to discharge me. He looked at me and he said, Beta, which is Hindi for son, Beta, I have given you back your life, but I cannot make you want to live. I've given you back your life, but I cannot make you want to live. I said, Doctor, that's been taken care of already. And so I say to you, with all of your successes, with all of the intellectual prowess and all of the ability, what are you really living for that's worth giving your entire life for? And what Christ says is when he changes your heart and mind, in that transformation process, he makes us live for the very purpose God has made us. Think of this for a moment. Can you go to the automobile manufacturer and tell them you are creating a weapon? You're creating a weapon. You are involved in killing people on the streets of London, on the streets of Paris, because you're making this automobile, it's a weapon. They would look at you and say, that's not what we intend this for. Purpose, even in inanimate objects, is so critical. How much more is it for you and me? A man who's no friend to the Christian, who is an avowed atheist, and chooses to live a life without boundaries. His name is Matthew Paris. He writes in the British newspapers regularly. He wrote an article sometime back which is absolutely astounding. And he goes to Africa to see the work of NGOs. And he saw a small group of Christians in Malawi. He was raised in Malawi. He saw what these Christians living a simple life had accomplished in Malawi. He wrote a brilliant article. And I wish I had the time to read all of it to you. But let me just leave the last two paragraphs. There's long been a fashion among Western academic sociologists for placing tribal value systems within a ring fence, beyond critiques founded in theirs and therefore the best for them, authentic and intrinsically of equal worth to ours. I simply don't follow this anymore. I observed that the tribal belief is no more peaceable than ours, and that it actually suppresses individuality. People think collectively. This feeds into the big man and gangster politics of the African city, the exaggerated respect for the swaggering leader, and the literal inability to understand the whole idea of the loyal opposition. Anxiety, fear of spirits of ancestors, of nature and the wild, strikes deep into the whole structure of rural African thought. A great weight grinds down upon the spirit of the people. Christianity, with its teaching of a direct personal two-way link between the individual and God, unmediated by the collective and unsubordinate to any other human being, smashes straight through the philosophical spiritual framework I've just described. Those who want Africa to walk tall amid 21st century global competition must not kid themselves that providing the material means or even the know-how that accompanies what we call development will end up making the change. The whole belief system has to be supplanted, and I'm afraid it has to be supplanted by another. Removing Christian evangelism from the African equation may leave the continent at the mercy of a malign fusion of Nike, the witch doctor, the mobile phone, and the machete. There's only one thing I disagree with him on this. It's not just Africa, it's the whole world. The gospel of evangelism that changes the heart is the only message we have. Where I have seen in parts of the world, people who are one time heading to behead others, now kneeling at an altar in humility and grace and forgiveness. That is the gospel story What does it mean to be human? From creation to the incarnation to transformation and consummation. The Bible gives us the narrative very clearly. As by Augustine said, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. Thank you so much for being here.